Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. So I'm representing actually two bodies. One is the National GCP, or Clinical Research Organization, in which I am active since more than a decade. And also my daily job is drug development. I'm developing drugs for Wockhardt Bio, which is a sponsor of clinical trials, and I'm mainly dedicated for novel antibiotic developments. And of course, prospectively, Greece is a very attractive country for this domain, by the way. So it's actually the time to start the debate, so I will not bore you a lot with my slides, I hope. Especially that the structure and the concept of my presentation is very similar to that of Professor Akan, who also found the 5 major things that are changing the landscape. Thanks God, mine are not overlapping too much. I just identified one, which is a good phenomenon that is pretty the same. Actually, I'm not going to talk too much about the scientific part of the clinical research and the new phenomena in that. That was the subject of the previous 2 speeches. I'm more now for the regulatory and operational part of it. So, the 5 things that are changing the landscape, not only over the 5 years, but I think for the 5 years they are at least even more intensive in changing how we conduct the clinical studies, in which environment we are operating in. The selection is purely subjective, of course. But the number one, I hope you would agree, everyone, for an EU country is the new EU Clinical Trial Regulation 536, which is already in force, but which does not yet apply. We are all waiting for EMA to complete the so-called EU portal. In my country, Poland, that is the hottest topic of the last months or even years, and I would imagine we will be discussing a lot on that later today, as Greece is equally affected by that regulation. Affected is maybe not the right word. There was a lot about being pessimistic or optimistic talk this morning. I am perhaps one of the few very optimistic guys for this regulation. That is because back in the history, you certainly all or most of you remember the history of the current clinical trial directive that was to harmonize the regulatory approach to clinical trials, in particular to authorizing clinical trials, and a national concept was and is still in force, wherein if you have a study in which 5 or 10 EU member states are participating, the regulatory process is taking place in each of these countries independently. And even worse, it does not occur at the same speed. And there are fast countries in terms of the regulatory process, which are obviously attracting the sponsors, and a bit slower countries in which the regulatory and perhaps also sometimes the ethics committee approval process is taking time. And for some countries there are also some other factors like hospital or investigator agreement contracting that can nicely spoil the whole timeline. Of what I know, Greece, also my country, is part of the latter population. And this is why sponsors like me, like Walkhart, when we need to conduct a small, fast study, I am, every time my heart is bleeding when I need to go to Netherlands or Belgium to make a phase 1 study, because my country is too slow in terms of the regulatory process. That will perhaps not change that much for, the new clinical trial regulation for the small studies, so one country studies, because they will be still in the national process, even if under the new clinical trial regulation. But it will significantly change the regulatory process for the multinational studies. So the concept of the clinical trial regulation is that, just as you certainly know, one selected member state, called the reference member state, will be doing the process of the clinical trial authorization for all concerned member states, and by default, all countries will start at the same time. So it is not difficult to predict that if everything goes well, those countries which were slower, like yours or mine, should benefit the most for the multinational studies, because we will be as fast as the current fast countries, plus of course, we will hopefully keep the benefits or the attractors for international sponsors which are currently there. I mean, the good population of patients, the access to patients, the great population of potential investigators and sites, which is already there, as it was mentioned in one of the opening remarks. You have, everything is there actually in Greece, for example. So, what is under debate in most EU countries, especially in those in which the ethics committees are, the ethics review system is based on multiple ethics committee system, like my country, and of course also as in Greece, where you have, as far as I know, both the national and local ethics committees. This is a challenge, how to meet the new timelines and how to build in the ethics approval into the whole clinical trial approval or authorization. In Poland, we are debating since at least 3 years with the regulator, with the ethics committees themselves. I am personally the leader of this discussion, as I am in charge of the ethics committees and ethics approval affairs on behalf of our association. And we are still not that far, means only now the regulator is drafting the new law or the new bylaw, whereas some other countries like Germany, for example, already have the new legislation and they are already testing the new solutions. The EU portal, the magic portal that will help everyone and that will be the main axe of the new system, is still under construction. As Fergus Sweeney, the legend of the good clinical practice, now working for EMA, recently said, this is the first time a pharmaceutical regulation has been made entirely dependent on a software system, which is very true. You can see how complex it will be. We can also enjoy a few screenshots of that portal, which is still under testing, and that most of us will be operating on pretty soon. The number 2 for me is what Professor Akan already told us, the e-revolution. It does not occur over the last 5 years, of course, but one of the pillars are the e-health records, medical records. There are many there are differences between countries in how much digitalized the medical files of patients generally are. So at the extreme end, as you can see at the left side of the picture, the exchange of paper medical files could be like that. The tomorrow solution is what everyone wants. However, it is a very tough thing. As far as I know, Greece is already almost fully done with the electronic prescription of drugs, but not yet with the electronic health records themselves, which are in big part still handwritten. This is pretty the same for my country, for example. The e-patient reported outcomes that has been already presented today, one of the concepts that seems interesting at the very bottom of the slide is the bring your own device concept. That is, nowadays nearly all patients already have their smartphones, and you could potentially and practically even use the devices by installing our clinical trial software to make them part of the clinical study. And then perhaps the newest, the really one that is emerging over the last 5 years is the e-consent, informed consent that is based on hypertext. So the informed consent itself, of course, it deserves a long debate and conference, and many of those has been already organized. Generally, I hope you would agree that informed consent forms are getting longer and longer and more complex and less understandable, perhaps, for the patient. Maybe not only perhaps, there is substantial evidence done by scientific methodology that the patient understands less and less. So every initiative should be welcome that is aimed at improvement of that understanding, and putting the patient not in the front of a paper, but perhaps in front of a computer in which the informed consent text is hypertexted. Hypertexted means the patient can further click on different links to see the definitions of the terms that are difficult for him, can even show films, right? Can even go to further web pages in which he can further be informed, he or she can be further informed. Of course, it cannot work for all trials, like difficult to imagine a patient in an emergency setting sitting in front of such of a device. However, for a majority of trials, this is a valuable proposal. Of course, it will not replace a direct physician-patient communication, right? But that is a valid tool. There is an increasing body of guidelines, especially in the USA, but also in the EU over the last years, that are regulatory guidance that are guiding the industry and the CROs and the investigators on the use of the e-tools. Number 3 for me is the access to clinical data. There is actually a silent revolution occurring not only in Europe but also in US. There is, since years, there is a buzz in the media saying that the pharma industry is not disclosing the whole truth, is not disclosing the results and of all clinical trials, especially those that have failed. There is a certain publication bias, as we call it, and also there are also claims that the decisions ultimately made by the drug registration authorities, like European Medicines Agency for innovative drugs in Europe, are not fully transparent. Means we cannot re-evaluate, reconsider the decisions to approve or to disapprove a new drug. So this is why the EMA has worked on and has already implemented 3 to 2 years back the new policy on access to clinical data, not only just to summaries of the clinical study reports, so that the clinical trial results, but also to patient-level data. You might see under the address clinicaldata.ema.europe.eu the new website that is already live. This is that website on the top of the screen, and there are already several dozens of novel therapeutics for which the full clinical study reports, but also the patient-level data are there. Of course, you cannot browse through them like that. You need to register, you need to justify your interest, but the general rule is that it is made publicly open, especially for academia, especially for some secondary or post hoc research, as there is still a lot of valuable data in that. At the other side of the Atlantic, the FDA is not that far. However, there are some private-public partnerships triggered by the big players, first of all, the pharma industry, to share clinical data as well, like the clinical study data request.com. There is a lot of big players there, including Roche, Sanofi, Novartis, Astellas, Bayer. There is the BMS Duke Clinical Research Institute initiative, and then at the bottom of the slide, the YODA project by Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic, together in partnership with Yale University. Number 4 for me is the new category of medicinal product, which are the biosimilars. There is an increasing number of biosimilar drugs. Biosimilar are told like to be like the monozygotic twins. They are very similar, but not necessarily really identical with the original biological drugs. Europe was actually the first to both put the regulatory framework in place for development and also regulatory guidance, but also to put the first biosimilar on the market, which was the Omnitrop, which was a decade ago already. There is an increasing number of biosimilar clinical trials. They have their own specificity. They might not be seen as much attractive as trials by all investigators because they are therapeutically not innovative, although they are pharmaceutically, biotechnologically fully innovative. That pathway in the US has been put in place substantially later. The first biosimilar drug authorized in USA was only 2 years back, a drug which was called biosimilar because before there was the generic pathway that was used in USA. I recommend, once you work with biosimilar developments and drug, to see the brand new brochure or handbook issued by European Medicines Agency earlier this year. EMA is saying over the last 10 years the safety system has not identified any relevant concern for biosimilars. So there is increasing confidence by the regulator, by EMA, because it is only EMA that is allowed for authorizing biosimilars on the European market, but all, of course, these products are welcome by health insurance due to obvious reasons. We have currently 33 biosimilars already authorized in Europe, and 10 of them were authorized earlier this year. So there is an increasing trend. That is a slide showing the saturation of the market of clinical trials with biosimilar studies. It is not very up to date. It's 3 years old, actually. I couldn't find a new one, but I'm pretty sure with a lot of new developments that it is even more intensive, and the biosimilar market, clinical trial market, is a sub-market by itself. And the fifth for me is the risk-based monitoring, a fully operational concept based on the finding that we were probably not allocating our resources appropriately by doing 100% source data monitoring, source data verification when monitoring clinical studies, and we should and we could actually allocate them in a more smart way, so focus on the data, on the sites, on the investigators which are actually or even potentially problematic. That is the concept of the risk-based monitoring, and that is already has been blessed by both FDA, EMA, and it has even been addressed in the new release of the ICH Good Clinical Practice. So either we work smarter or harder. If we cannot work smarter, we are still supposed to work harder. Thank you so much, and I think it will be time for the debate, right?